Welcome to Vices and Volumes. I'm your host, Avril Clinton Ford, and every 2 weeks I explore the weird and wonderful from my own collection of 19th century books. In this week's episode, I've been reading through a fascinating book that catalogues the social history of the London poor. It was written by an Englishman and published in 1851. It's vivid, full of curiosity, and has that particular tone of Victorian condescension and sympathy that is a little hard to swallow. But before I begin, if you love the podcast and you'd like to help support me, I do have a Ko-fi account, which allows you to donate the price of a coffee to me, which supports the software, the equipment, and the books, and allows me to continue the podcast for as long as possible without advertising. I'll add this to the show notes as well, but it'll also be in my socials, which are Vices and Volumes everywhere. I'm on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, YouTube, and Threads. So please follow me there for any updates and news, and also comment. Let me know what you think of the podcast. This week's book is The London Labour and the London Poor by Henry Mayhew. I picked this up in Dublin in an antique shop. I don't have the complete set. I have the first volume of the first publication, and I have the remaining 4 volumes of the ones that were published later in the 1860s. I picked it up in Needful Things in Dublin. So this was actually 3 volumes published in 1851, and it eventually grew to 4 in 1860s. Together they run something approaching 2 million words. He interviewed everyone. Mudlarks who spent their days combing through the Thames and low tide for anything sellable, rat catchers, bone grubbers, chimney sweeps, Punch and Judy men, and the section that really caught my interest is the Irish street sellers of London. Just over 10,000 of them by his estimate. They were selling fruit, fish, nuts, oranges, watercress, and begging while they sold. Because without begging, some of them, as he puts it bluntly, might starve outright. This is the Irish immigrant in 1851, just 1 year before the official end of the famine, told through an Englishman's notebook. Henry Mayhew was born in London 1812. He was the son of a solicitor. He was educated at Westminster School, one of the most prestigious in the country, and he ran away from it. So he went to sea instead. He obviously failed to settle into his father's law practice. He wrote a very successful farce, though, called The Wandering Minstrel in 1834. It was an instant hit and remained a staple of Victorian music halls for decades. The fact that Mayhew's first real success was built around a lovable rogue navigating society from the bottom up tells us a little something. Then in 1841, he was one of the co-founders of Punch magazine, which certainly influenced the lens with which he viewed the world. He was also, at various points in his adult life, hiding from creditors in Wales, filing for bankruptcy, and spending almost a decade in Paris because Paris was more comfortable than England if you owed money to the wrong people. He and William Thackeray were apparently great friends, which makes sense. 2 men, very good at prose, and periodic financial disasters. The point is that Mayhew was not a politician, not a philanthropist, in the formal Victorian sense, and not in any straightforward way an activist. He was a journalist who had, as the Encyclopaedia Britannica notes, a genius for lively and sensitive reportage. When the Morning Chronicle commissioned a survey of the working poor in 1849, apparently it piqued his curiosity. He went into the worst courts in London, he sat in people's rooms, he listened at length, and he wrote down what he heard in the actual voices of the people used, in their dialect, stumbles, corrections, and the full awkwardness of speech. His friend Charles Dickens walked with him on some of these trips, and the results he described them as a picture of human life so wonderful, so awful, so piteous and strange. Dickens didn't write that kind of admiring description about many people. What made Mayhew unusual and what makes the Irish section so interesting and also occasionally a little maddening is that he mostly let people speak for themselves. He didn't clean up any testimony. He didn't translate the dialect into polite English. The result is that you can read 170-year-old interviews and hear something remarkably close to how people actually spoke. The book is not just figures and numbers, but there is a concerted effort to investigate the people that make up the London poor. He's not trying to state biased facts and figures wrapped up in attitudes of the time, where the middle classes viewed poverty not as a systemic failure, but as a direct result of ingrained laziness and failing motivation to help oneself. The other thing worth saying about him before we get into the section is that Mayhew had a system. He divided all the poor of London into 3 categories: those who will work, those who cannot work, and those who will not work. Within his own pages, though, he keeps tripping over his own taxonomy. The people he interviews are not where they are by choice, and he knows it. The book mostly focuses on Mayhew's English costermongers as the baseline. They are the norm, however the Irish are the exotic and the foreign. As are every other culture and every other class, they are being observed as exotic creatures to be studied like a different species, the Homo destitutus. But when it comes to the Irish, everything is measured against the English poor as a template of regularity. The Irish are observed, they are noteworthy. They wear hoods instead of bonnets, they sell from the floor instead of barrows. They are simply foreign. The things he finds remarkable about them are a running list of ways in which they are not English. These people left very little else behind. No letters, no diaries, no archives, and what survived is his record of the London poor, and within that, the Irish surviving in this challenging environment. Mayhew has done his research in an age where the flow of information was considerably more challenging than today, and he takes his time to explain how 10,000 Irish people came to be in London in the first place. Mayhew lists 4 causes and adds his reserved thoughts on this without calling them out. First, he tells the reader they were driven over by the famine when they could not procure food. Second, by evictions, when their landlords had left them no room for shelter in their own home. Third, by the hope of better prospects. Fourth, by the seasonal harvest work that became permanent because there was nothing to go back to. And then, in brackets, as though he's aware he's stepping outside his brief, he adds that the ingenuity people employed to raise the cost of leaving Ireland. The shift, the devices, the plans would at some future point form a very remarkable chapter. He knows there is a whole other story underneath the one he's telling. He just doesn't quite have the framework to tell it. To give him credit, he saw the real causes, and between the lines he kind of called it out. Mayhew begins with the Irish filling the gap in what the Jews apparently left open for the taking. The section opens with a remarkable piece of information dropped so casually. The orange season in London was called the Irishman's harvest. How did that happen? The answer is a very good story. Orange selling in London had, until the 1820s or so, been almost entirely in the hands of the Jewish traders, who had built what Mayhew calls the Orange Monopoly around 1810. Their particular territory was the coaching inns, the Belles Sauvages on Ludgate Hill, the Sarson's Head on Snow Hill. They knew the timetables. They were at the door right when the coach arrived and at another door in time for its departure. According to Mayhew's informant, some of them were earning as much as £100 a year in this trade. By the mid-1820s, the more lucrative sidelines of razors, pencils and sponges were drawing their attention away from fruit. Mayhew describes the coaching inn experience of the era with detail. It was a common remark at the time that no one could reach or leave the metropolis, even for the shortest journey, without being expected to be in urgent want of oranges and lemons, black lead pencils, sticks of sealing wax, many-bladed penknives, pocket combs, razors, strops, braces and sponges. As the Jewish traders moved towards the more profitable sponge and pencil end of the market, the Irish moved in on the monopoly of the oranges, specifically from around 1836 to 1840, and the Irish had 2 specific competitive advantages. The first was eloquence. Mayhew is very clear about this. The Jewish traders, he said flatly, were merely traders. The Irish begged, pathetically and with many benedictions on their listeners. The Irish ability of spinning a yarn was apparently extremely effective. The second advantage was helpfulness. As an Irish lad at a coaching inn would not only sell an orange, he would lend a hand to an overloaded coach porter without being asked. The yard staff noticed. They preferred the Irish. The trade followed. And then we're introduced to Father Mathew. Father Theobald Mathew was a Capuchin friar from Tipperary who in April 1838 stood up at a meeting of the Cork Total Abstinence Society, signed a large book with the words, "Here goes in the name of God," and took the pledge of total abstinence. About 60 people followed him that evening. By 1841, he claimed to have administered the pledge to 5 million people. At a time when the entire population of Ireland was just over 8 million, And then he brought the movement to Scotland and England, where he is recorded to having signed up some 600,000 people in 3 months. The famine essentially dismantled what he'd built, though. As historian John F. Quinn documents in his study, Father Mathew's Crusade, it was precisely those countries where the temperance movement had been the strongest that the famine had hit the hardest. Father Mathew's own health collapsed, his debts accumulated, he'd given away medals to everyone who took the pledge and neglected to think about how he was going to pay for them. And the movement he'd built struggled on without momentum, and he died in 1856. But in 1851, enough of the pledge held that Mathew recorded something a publican found exasperating. The Irish street sellers who had taken the pledge kept it, rigidly. They didn't spend their evenings in the theatre or the concert room. They could live on very little and undercut the competition and still survive. The Irish could live as separately as the Jew, but they did not, like him, squander any money for the evening's amusement at the concert or the theatre. Before we leave the drinking question entirely, I want to give you Mayhew's breakdown of alcohol consumption among the Irish street sellers, because it is a masterclass in a finding that produces more questions than it answers. He establishes, through a landlord of a large public house, that the Irish drank considerably less beer than the English. The landlord reckoned that there was roughly as many Irish as English among his customers, but the Irish almost never sent beer back to their rooms as part of a meal, and this being apparently a significant English habit. Fewer Irish teetotalers were technically required because fewer Irish were drinking that particular way to begin with. However, the Irish street sellers who frequent the gin palaces or public houses drink far more frequently a quartern of gin, very seldom whiskey, oftener than the English. Less beer, more gin, and the reason for the gin rather than the whiskey? Cost. The old Irish fruit seller who admitted freely that he enjoyed a glass of gin told Mayhew that he hadn't tasted whiskey in 14 years because of the price, sir. When Mayhew interviews an innkeeper who has no interest in being measured about any of this, "I'd rather have 20 poor Englishmen drink in my tap room than a couple of poor Irishmen. The Irish will quarrel with anybody. The Irish will, and sometimes clear the room by swearing. They'll use knives. By Jesus, if there's a scuffle, they'll kick like devils and scratch and bite like women or cats, instead of using their fists. I wish all the Irish were teetotalers, if it were only to be rid of them." He wishes them all sober purely for his own peace of mind, and you don't really blame him for that. Mayhew deserves plenty of credit when it comes to building evidence of a story of the poor. Essentially, he's wandering through London's poorest areas and chatting to people on both sides of the fence. He remains mostly impartial and paints a vivid picture of the Irish people and their challenges. Because of his gift for listening, he produces something no economic survey could: the exact inventory of what a life costs when it's taken apart and sold. He gives us a middle-aged man from County Limerick in corduroy trousers and a greatcoat too big for him, buttoned tight. He has about an acre in Limerick, just about enough to live on, if the potatoes were good. Then the famine came, and here's his account. "The sore times came, and the taties was affected. And the wife and me, I've no childer, hadn't a bite nor a sup but water to live on, and a nigger too. I felt the famine a-coming. I saw people a-feeding on the wild greens and things, and I had not such a bad take. I got Mister, he was the master agent, to give me 28 for a possession in quietness, and I sold the poultry I had. Their eggs was a blessing to keep the life in us. I sold them in Limerick for 3 shillings and 3 pence, the poor things, 4 of them. The furniture I sold to the neighbours for somehow about 6 shilling. Is the truth I'm telling you, sir, and then there was 2 shilling owing of it still, and will be a perpetual loss. The wife and me walked to Dublin, though we'd have better gone by the long say, but I didn't understand it then, and we got to Liverpool." He walked to Dublin when he could have taken the ship the long way round on the sea. That walk to Dublin, according to Google Maps, is 2 days solid with no breaks or rest, around about 200 kilometres in total today. The 4 chickens, the 3 shillings and the 3 pence. The furniture, 6 shillings, with 2 still owing, a perpetual loss. How specific this is what gets to you. Not the tragedy in the abstract, but the exact accounting of everything surrendered and how little there was to be surrendered. He ends up in London through a connection, a man he knew who portered Covent Garden. Thinks that having worked land, costermonger would make sense. A loan of 10 shillings given to him through a priest by a stranger whose name he never learned sets him up. When Mayhew asks whether he'd ever go back to Ireland, the answer is the same as every other person in this section gives. Sure then, sir, what good could I do there? The Irish poor knew there was no work, no security, no life for them left in Ireland. They did not have a hatred for England, not a love of it neither. Just the arithmetic of somebody who had weighed the options and found there to be only one. Mayhew has some colourful observation about the Irish women in this trade. He sees them as unskilled and relatively useless, while at the same time he calls out the volume of work that they really manage to handle. This is a great example of his blind spots. He is obscured by the Victorian attitudes of what was English and normal. He concludes that the Irish women are essentially incapable of anything useful. They can't sew, can't do domestic work. A needle is as useless in their fingers as a pen. They've been forced into street selling because there's nothing else available to them. Mayhew isn't quite right even in his diagnosis of the needle problem. The fine shirt making that English slop employers needed wasn't a skill rural Irish women had failed to acquire. It was a skill that had no economic use in the world that they came from. The big houses employed imported English women in domestic service for the fine work. And for the Irish women, that meant scrubbing floors, carrying turf, cooking for large households if they were lucky. As scholar Joanna Burke has documented in her work on women's household economy in Ireland, rural women's productive skills centred on the land, on animal husbandry, on the kitchen garden. After the collapse of the home textile production across Ireland in 1815, it removed what little cottage sewing economy had actually existed. What remained was the land. To understand the scale of what we're talking about, Ireland in 1841 had recorded a population of 8.2 million, which is suspected to be significantly higher. But it was the highest it had ever been before or since, representing 31% of the entire United Kingdom's population at the time. Only 15% lived in towns of more than 2,000 people. 2/3 of all Irish families depended chiefly on agriculture. There were, according to Dr. Terence Dooley of Maynooth University, over 4,000 big house estates controlled by between 8,000 and 10,000 landowners. Fewer than 1,000 of whom owned more than half the country between them. Even the most generously staffed households, like Stokestown and Mayo, reportedly ran to 50 servants of a family of 7, and that could only absorb only a fraction of the local female labour. With 40% of Irish homes recorded in the 1841 census as single-roomed mud cabins with no windows, the women Mayhew was writing about had never lived with the economic reach of the English domestic service market. The needle and thread of the English slop trade belonged to a different world entirely, and that world has been remade almost beyond recognition. The Republic of Ireland today has a population of around 5.4 million. In the 1840s, 85% of the population was rural and 2/3 worked the land. Today, though, roughly 63% of Irish people live in urban areas, and agriculture accounts for under 4% of total employment, around 109,000 people. Of those 4,000 big houses in the 1840s, fewer than 100 survive intact. The landscape Mayhew subjects came from has been replaced by something the Limerick man, selling his 4 chickens for 3 shillings and 3 pence, could not have imagined. While Mayhew may not have seen Irish women's work as productive, he did miss what they were doing to survive. Women were managing fruit stalls in all weathers, raising children all alone, begging with great skill, sending money home to parents they'll never see again, providing food for their families on 6 pence a day. He says they can't do anything, but he lists everything they're doing. There's a widow he interviews who has 3 living children and a fruit stall in Clare Market, which she's worked for 7 years. Her husband died and left her with 5 children and a confinement coming. She has since lost 3 of them, including a boy of 12 who died of a lung complaint she attributes to being out in all weathers shouting to sell fruit. Her income across that spring and summer averages 3 shillings and 6 pence a week, of which she pays 1 and 6 in rent. That leaves her 2 shillings and 9 pence for herself and her children. For fuel, she sends the children to the market to collect waste walnuts to bring them home. She dries them, and between those and a pennyworth of coal, they manage. She has neither chair nor table. A board on 2 baskets does the duty for one. An old penny tea canister serves as a candlestick. There's also the question of money. Specifically, how do you start with nothing in a foreign city and build enough of a foothold to survive? The answer in this is community. It was each other. Mayhew documents a system of interest-free loans that he records with what I read as slightly reluctant admiration. If a street seller needed 2 shillings, more prosperous Irish labourers, such as bricksellers and dock workers, would club together a shilling each and lend it. No interest charged, repaid whenever they could. Money also moved through the priests, who were the channel through which charitable Catholics of better means made practical donations to those who needed them. This is nothing new to the Irish communities. At that time, they would support each other no matter what, lending what is needed, giving what they can, they get it back in cash or in kind. They have always looked after their own. This extended beyond those left behind. As soon as one family member was earning enough, a portion of every week's income was sent until there was enough to bring the next person over, one after another. An English costermonger watching all this gave Mayhew the most concise verdict on offer. I don't like the Irish, but they do stick to one another far more than we do. One of his testimonies is of a woman he describes in one sentence, as I think contains more history than most chapters. She then sir, it's threepence I've taken today and tuppence will pay for me night's lodging. She's taken 3p and 2p, and tuppence, goes to the lodging house. A penny left, and then, I'm an orphan, sir. There's nobody to care for me in the world. I have no heart to keep count. No heart to keep count of the years. She doesn't know how long she's been in England. She doesn't complain. She recognises that she's a roof over her head, money for her survival. There's nothing in Ireland, but she feels the loss with every ounce of her being. Rosemary Lane is now Royal Mint Street, though hardly anything else from Mayhew's time survives there. This was the heart of what he calls the nest of Irish. It was entire courts and streets, almost exclusively Irish. He describes walking down through it. As you walk down the lane and peep through the narrow openings between the houses, the place seems like a huge peep show with dark holes of gateways to look through, while the court within appears bright within the daylight, and down it are seen rough-headed urchins running with their feet bare through the puddles, and bonnetless girls huddled in shawls lolling against the doorposts. Sometimes you see a long, narrow alley, with the houses so close together that the opposite neighbours are talking from their windows. White ropes stretched zigzag from wall to wall afford just enough room to dry a blanket or a couple of shirts that swell out dropsically in the wind. For an English reader in 1851, the barefoot children and bonnetless women are marks of poverty. The bonnet was a signal of female respectability. A middle-class woman did not go outside without one, and what was true of the middle class filtered down through the rest of society as an aspiration. No bonnet, disordered, improper, not quite right. However, this is simply what Irish women wore. The garment served exactly the same purpose, it just had a different history. He observes a group gathered at the mouth of a court of houses, like he is a narrator in a nature documentary. The men were all dressed in long tailcoats, with 1 or 2 brass buttons. The old dame, with a face wrinkled like a dried plum, had her cloak placed over her head like a hood, and the grizzly hair hung down in marked hanks about her face, her black eyes shining between the locks of those like a Skye terrier. Beside her was another old woman smoking a pipe so short that her nose reached over the bowl. After looking at the low foreheads and long bulging upper lips of some of the group, it was pleasant to gaze upon the pretty faces of 1 or 2 girls that lolled against the wall, their black hair smoothed with grease and shining almost as if japanned, and their large grey eyes with thick dark fringe of lash seemed out of place amongst the hard features of their companions. Low foreheads and bulging upper lips, hair matted like a Skye terrier. These are tainted and skewed observations exaggerated by the magazines of the time. They are the vocabulary of physiognomy, the pseudoscientific practice of reading character and intelligence from facial features. And by 1851, that vocabulary had been thoroughly absorbed into how educated Victorians understood racial differences. Mayhew, having been the co-founder of Punch magazine a decade earlier, and Punch was the primary vehicle through which images of Irish as subhumans were distributed to the British public. As historian L. Perry Curtis Jr. documents in his landmark study of apes and angels, the Irishman in Victorian caricature, the escalating demonisation of the Irish in comic weeklies like Punch, Judy and Fun ran in direct parallel to the crisis of the famine and the growth of Irish nationalism, with cartoonists increasingly reaching for simian imagery, low brows, prognathous jaws, ape-like posture, to mark the Irish as a lesser race. John Leach, one of Punch's chief illustrators, was among those who established the visual template. The language of the skull measures and the language of the satirical press were, by the mid-century, feeding each other. Mayhew may have been influenced by all of this. He had sat in the room where it was produced, but the fact that 2 paragraphs later he records the same people maintaining spotless domestic interiors and sending money home to parents does not seem to give him pause. These are separate registers, and he sees no contradiction. The poor at that time were considered dirty, unkempt, lazy and disorganised. But the image of the neighbours talking from opposite windows, laundry drying on zigzag ropes, someone who tends their laundry and hangs it out is someone who cares about how their shirts look. Mayhew is recording poverty with one eye and the evidence of household maintenance with the other, without quite putting those 2 observations together. He goes inside some of the homes and he surprises himself. In all the houses that I entered were traces of household care and neatness that I had little expected to have seen. The cupboards fastened in the corner of the room and stocked with mugs and cups. The mantelpiece with its images and the walls covered with showy coloured prints of saints and martyrs gave an air of comfort that strangely disagreed with the reports of the cabins in Ould Ireland. Strangely disagreed. He came in with one picture of the dirt floor, the absent domestic ambition, the cabins of Ould Ireland. The picture of Ould Ireland and its specific source, the odds are very good that it came in the least part from his friend, Thackeray. In 1842, William Makepeace Thackeray had spent 4 months travelling around Ireland and published the results the following year as the Irish Sketchbook, a travel account that became one of the most widely read English language accounts of pre-famine Ireland. Thackeray was already a close friend of Mayhew's from their Paris years, and the 2 had collaborated on the comic Almanac in 1844. Thackeray had described what he saw: poverty, striking and continuous shabbiness that a Londoner would not encounter in a year of living in the city. The contrast between the grand estate houses and the desperate state of rural cottages, and he recorded beggars and barefoot children and their general air of make and do that clearly stayed with him. The sketch of Skibbereen captured the domestic interior. Every article within is a makeshift, has been ingeniously perverted from its original destination. Bread sharing space with blackening, cold bacon beside broken teacups, no clear dividing line between the functional and the squalid. This was the Ireland that educated English readers in 1851, and this is what they already understood. Mayhew walked into Rosemary Lane carrying that picture in his mind, and what he found did not quite match it. He found china on the windowsills, 30 pictures of holy men with yellow glories around their heads, a tumbler of beads on the ledge, chintz curtains looped around the bed. One room is so full of furniture he calls it almost a curiosity for domestic management. The table is so large it divides the room in 2. He visits one family of 5 and 2 rooms. The boards strewn with red sand is a way of keeping the floors clean. The front room has 3 beds with printed curtains drawn around them. The family live in the back room, set up as a parlour, crowded to excess with chairs and tables, pictures all the way up the staircase. It's midday, warm autumn weather, but the fire is going, as much for light as it is for heat. And the mother, children and visitors are all crouched around it as though it's January. Elsewhere he finds a room newly arrived at. Bare walls, bare floor, a husband and wife who appear to be in a confrontation but are, he's told, simply planning. No furniture at all except the patches of whitewash where the previous tenants' pictures had hung. He also finds an old woman he gives considerable space to. The one-room lined wall with domestic arrangement, and the woman herself equally remarkable. She wears a pilot coat over her gown, well stained with fish slime. Her petticoats are short and she has a button of a nose with nostrils he describes as entering her face like bullet holes. He's trying to describe someone he finds physically unusual, and the effect today is partially uncomfortable and partially, because of where the passage goes, unexpectedly tender. Because when you strip away the physical observations of what Mayhew clearly thought were informative science, what's left is a room of extraordinary domestic care maintained by a woman who has a genuinely difficult time of it. This is the same domestic instinct as any English household of the era: the carefully tended mantelpiece, the displayed china, the picture over the fireplace. Saints where there might be hunting scenes, beads where there might be a clock. The impulse is identical. This is home, and we're proud of it. The one thing that struck me during the visit to this neighbourhood was the apparent listlessness and lazy appearance of the people. The boys at play were the only beings who seemed to have any life in their actions. The women, in their pallid shawls, strolled along the pavements, stopping each friend for a chat, or joining some circle and leaning against the wall as though utterly deficient in energy. The men smoked, with their hands in their pockets, listening to the old crones talking, and only now and then grunting out a reply when a question was directly put to them. And yet it is curious that these people who, here, seem as inactive as Negroes, will perform the severest bodily labour, undertaking tasks that the English are almost unfitted for. The final comparison is a double-down racial slur that tells you a great deal about the casual bigotry of the era, and nothing at all useful about either the Irish or the African people, so I'll move past it. But the observation underneath it, the apparent contradiction between what he sees here and what he knows these people do, is interesting. And Mayhew doesn't quite have the tools to resolve it. He's looking at people who work in intensive bursts: dock labourers, bricklaying, excavation, railway construction. These are not occupations that run 9 to 5. They are hard, physical work done in concentrated periods, followed by rest. The historian E.P. Thompson, writing about the imposition of the industrial time discipline on the British working class, describes how the shift from task-oriented labour to clock-regulated work was a cultural transformation, not just an economic one, and one that working people resisted in ways that the newly industrious middle class read as laziness. The Irish, moreover, were between jobs. The seasonal rhythms that structured their working year, harvest work in summer, dock work when available, the orange trade in winter, meant that the midday street scene that Mayhew was watching was precisely what an off-season afternoon looked like. These were people preserving their energy because they needed it. Maybe he felt that the poor should be busy, always pursuing an income, but they were doing just what people do when they live in the same street as each other, talking. He had mistaken community for listlessness. As Mayhew carries out his documentation, he recognises the important role that the priest plays in Irish lives, and he takes the time to join one of them as he makes his rounds, and what he describes is a one-man social infrastructure. Everywhere the people ran out to meet him. He had just returned to them, I found, and the news spread round, and the women crowded to the doorsteps and came creeping up from cellars through trap doors merely to curtsy to him. One old crone, as he passed, cried, "You're a good father, heaven comfort you." And the boys playing at full speed would pull up to touch their hair, and the stall women would rise from their baskets while all noise, even a quarrel, ceased until he had passed by. This gives me the comical image of John and Mary from Father Ted, who were short of murdering each other, and as soon as Father Ted turned up, they would suddenly be madly in love again. This sudden reaction shows how important and revered the priest was to the community. Through modern eyes, it might seem like a little too much, but then the priest was a lifeline, a support network, an educated and connected person who could help at the worst of times. Mayhew records without apparent surprise that money was advanced to the poor through the priests, sometimes from the priest's own pocket. He kept their savings books entries. He gave advice on who to trust and what to do. He was an anchor in rough seas and the thread that connected them to Ireland. After his time with the priest, Mayhew introduces us to the affectionately named Old Norah. Mayhew gives her more space than anyone else in the section. 9 years before his visit, she'd been found drunk in the gutter, pelted with orange peel and mud by passing boys. The priest carried her to a chapel and left her before the sanctuary. When she sobered up, she took the pledge. In 3 years, she had £15 in the savings bank, the priest keeping her book, and she had bought herself the dress of a religious association. Green velvet dress. She was, she tells Mayhew, the best dressed woman in the court. Then her brother came home from the army with a shilling a day pension and a genius for other people's savings. He persuaded her to break the pledge. He got all £15 and spent them. She couldn't cut him off. He was the only kin I had on earth, she says. Her joints swelled, she ended up in hospital. Everything remaining was eaten up by the sufferance. She attributes her whole disaster with a theological precision that I find a little bit moving to the first priest having left the parish. Now he's back and she'll recover. When he comes in while Mayhew is visiting old Norah, half divided between joy at seeing him and shame at being again a beggar, laughs and weeps at the same time, wiping her eyes with the shawl, asking him please not to scold her, for she was a weak woman. The renegade brother is brought to receive a lecture, and Mayhew's description of his expression, a more Scottish idiotic face would be difficult to imagine. He stood with his hands hanging down like the paws of a dog begging. Old Norah stood beside him, groaning like a bagpipe, every time the priest criticised her brother, as though every reproach were aimed at her. Mayhew arrived in Rosemary Lane armed with a set of assumptions about Irish cabins, about Irish women and their useful incapabilities, about the kind of disorder that poverty and foreignness together would produce. He had his system, those who will work, those who cannot, and those who will not. But what he found was community, pride in their homes, and that unique kind of charm that only the Irish truly possess. Whether any of this changed him in a permanent sense, we can't know. But there is an empathy and a turning subtle change in the opinions that's not quite present in the same way elsewhere in the volume. What Mayhew produced is an imperfect, biased, occasionally condescending, and entirely irreplaceable record of people who left almost nothing else behind. No letters, no diaries, no portraits, no wills to be contested. The Limerick man's 3 shillings and 3p, the orphan's penny left after the night's lodging, and Norah's green velvet dress, all described with precision that 170 years later, it paints a vivid picture. He went looking for a case study in poverty and found people that were poor financially but rich in community. I picked this up in Needful Things in Dublin, not quite knowing what I had. You open a book like this expecting to be dry Victorian social commentary, and instead you find the Limerick man's 4 chickens, old Nora's velvet dress, and a young woman with no heart to keep count of the years she's been away from home. It's not a survey, it's a portrait of the Irish people. Mayhew was imperfect, his punch instincts never really fully left him, and his taxonomy was moralistic, and his physiognomy was wrong in ways that he never questioned. But he also walked into those courts where he had no obligation to. He sat in people's rooms, and he wrote down what he found with enough fidelity that 170 years later, you can hear the accent. What we can appreciate is that he gave a voice to people who had left nothing behind. Today we are sitting on an island that has 3 million fewer people than it did in the year this was published. An island that has changed beyond recognition. People have moved away from the land and into large towns and cities to work. The community documented, dispersed within a generation. But everything they said, everything they held dear, was still there. Some things still travel, and these have travelled through time. Until next time, may your orange season be profitable. May your complete inability to sew a shirt never be mistaken for a character flaw, and may you never have a forehead that is considered insufficiently high. This has been Vices and Volumes. I'm Avril. Thank you for listening.